All right. We are now live for the March AMA, and I'm dressed a little bit more formally than usual, in part because I was just shooting some videos on Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, because my students are engaging with that in a few weeks, or in essay one, as far as the stuff I'm shooting. So let's see. We've already got a lot of questions here. Let's start running through them. Let me actually get something out of the way to begin with at the start. I've talked about figures that people ask me about all the time, like Slavoj Žižek or Nick Land or Jordan Peterson, or all these sort of pop culture figures of philosophy. And so I don't, those are going to be low priority questions because I've talked about those people so often. All right, Mason says, given your philosophical eclecticism, I wonder which philosophers as well as other figures have views on human nature. I mean, I would say like probably hundreds. And part of my views on human nature are that we don't fully understand human nature much of the time, and we're using models that can be more or less helpful to understand it, but we shouldn't claim that we fully grasp it, given how reflexive human nature is and how complex it is. So, I mean, I rely on literary figures who I think have a lot of insight. Some of them are contemporary, we could call them contemporary speculative fiction writers, like, for example, Ursula K. Le Guin and Philip K. Dick. Somebody who I'm doing this month, R. Scott Bakker, I think has some interesting insights. A lot of philosophers play into that. Some psychologists. Remember, psychology came out of philosophy in the first place. So it's not as if it's totally cut off from it as a separate discipline, although sometimes people within the discipline of psychology like to do that, just as people in other disciplines do. So, there's so many figures that I don't know that I would pick any in particular. Zach says, were you ever rejected from any grad schools you applied to? If so, how did you get over the pain? Rejections from grad schools was not that big of an issue for me. I only applied to 10. I had no useful advice on how to do it. And back then, the GRE had 3 different sections to it, and I maxed out one of the sections. So I had very high scores, so schools were interested in letting me in, even overlooking my totally crazy writing sample where I took my senior thesis, which was on truth self-referential statement groups, and wrote a 3-page thing about how the functional approach that I took with it could actually be analogized to a geometrical approach, which would be involve the Möbius strip. And the place where I actually did get accepted, the chair said, the writing sample almost killed you, but you had high enough scores that we let you in because we figured there had to be something to what you were doing. And so that wasn't really the main issue for me. I did have some setbacks, like, for example, Marquette University. Oh, the input volume is really low. There we go. Let's fix that. I don't know what's up with these friggin' Apple products some of the time. The updates get worse and worse. Anyway, Marquette lost my letters of recommendation, and that's a big deal. And the chair, I met up with him later on at a coffee house, and I don't know what's going on with the input volume. Is everyone able to hear all right? Because my computer is acting kind of weird with the sound thing. Maybe somebody could weigh in very quickly before I keep going on. Was it too soft at the start? I'm looking at the sound thing, and it's just like creeping itself downward as I'm speaking. Not quite sure what that's about. Well, I'll wait. Okay, Mark says can hear me fine. Good. So anyway, they lost my letters of recommendation. The chair was really ticked off, said I'll look into this, but by then the damage was done. I've encountered a lot more rejection in terms of two other things: the job market and publication, right? Sometimes you can send something in for publication and people are like, you know, the sound went back down again. So there we go. Jack it back up. You can put stuff in for publication and it can get rejected for all sorts of crazy reasons. Sometimes people will just say, find a reason to reject this. I've seen editors do that. You don't really know what's going on with any of these things, with grad school applications, with job applications, with publishing, unless you know people on the inside. And if you do, you probably already have the contacts that are helping you out, right? And that isn't the case for most of us. When it comes to job applications, I would apply sometimes for positions and get an email back saying, oh, we had 500 qualified applicants. So much of stuff in philosophy and in the humanities is really based on a stratification that has a lot to do with class and prestige and very little to do with talent or anything like that. So, the number one thing to do when you get rejected is to say, this isn't really about me. This is about whatever decision procedure they were carrying out in their time. That's what it's really focused on. And I don't have control over that. I'm not responsible for how these people make their choices. So, those are things that I think you could keep in mind. The other thing is, if you're rejected from one place, that has really nothing to do with any other place. They're all doing different things. I've actually sent articles out that got rejected at one place, and they're like, this is terrible stuff, right? You send it out to the next place, maybe even without any modifications, and they're like, this is amazing, right? So there's a lot of subjectivity in this, and I wouldn't take too much to heart. It does suck to get rejected, and it might be useful to commiserate with other people who are in that situation. This is a particularly bad year for getting rejected from grad schools. I'm seeing it a lot in my Twitter. All right, Gutter Grown. What do I think about how Leibniz justifies the existence and compatibility of free will with an extreme deterministic worldview by claiming the perceived paradox is really a correlation fallacy? I don't know that he says that the perceived paradox is a correlation fallacy. I'm trying to remember exactly how he frames it. I think those are very late modern terms to describe what Leibniz himself was doing. But I think Leibniz. So the basic issue you're asking about here is, what do I think about Leibniz's compatibilism? I don't think that his everything is monads and they're connected together through these relations in some way. I don't really buy that, but it's very interesting. I think it's well worth reading the Discourse on Metaphysics and some of his correspondence, with Arnaud and things like that. Gmail Stan says, regarding Aristotle, was it you that once described definition and scope to be two prerequisites to his use of logic? That does not sound like me at all. I don't have any idea who said that. So. Mark asks, how's it going? My department is doing a thing for the Ides of March, and I was wondering if I know any good Roman recipes. I don't know any good Roman recipes myself, but I do know that they certainly had a wide array of things that they would cook. And there are some good cookbooks and websites out there devoted to ancient cooking. So I would go and check those out. And, the one thing that could be a bit tricky is sourcing ingredients, right? Because you might not be able to get precisely what the recipes would call for, right? Kiki, or what is this? Kish is the bad lampshade. How to deal with intellectual insecurity. No matter how much I learn, I feel like I'm not well read enough or unqualified to take part in discussions because I still haven't read this or that theorist. Okay, so that's a good question. You will never have read everybody, and you will never have read all of the essentials in any field at this point in time, because it's just not possible. and you will have forgotten, 90% of what you read the first time anyway. So that's the bad news. The good news is everybody's in that situation, right? Even the people who you look up to as being like these intellectual, powerhouses. Like, I've had the opportunity in my career to get to meet some rock stars of philosophy, right? So got to work with Alistair McIntyre, for example, and I've got to meet Julia Annis and Chris Gill, who's one of my colleagues in modern Stoicism, and A. Long. I got to cross paths with him, and quite a few other people like that as well. And they're all in the same boat as the rest of us. Nobody's read everything, and if you have conversations with them, what's cool about a lot of these big intellectual heavy hitters, as opposed to people who are big names but are kind of full of themselves, is that they'll say, "Oh yeah, I didn't know about that person at all." Like I got to point out to Alistair McIntyre that there are some really interesting parallels between his own ideas and Gabriel Marcel. And in the conversation, he didn't say like, "Well, that's because Gabriel Marcel got them from me," or anything, implausible like that. He's like, "I'm gonna have to go read Gabriel Marcel. Thanks. That's really helpful." So, everybody is in that same boat of not having read enough. You might also be feeling insecurity due to other reasons that don't respond directly to those sorts of cognitive reframings. And then you want to explore that, like sometimes we've been told that we're stupid or we're never going to get things by, parents or professors or other people who were jerks in our life. And that can have kind of a toll on us. And if possible, you want to try to, work on and work through that sort of stuff, right? So you can take, directly cognitive approaches. Remind yourself of the fact that any library you walk into, nobody's read all those books. If they claim to because they were a speed reader, they're full of crap, and they don't remember 90% of what it is that they speed read their way through. We're all doing kind of a selective thing, and the other thing to say too is, so I mentioned academia is very prestige ridden, my experience in dealing with people from elite institutions is that they're no smarter or more talented or even often better educated than the rest of us. They just happen to think highly of themselves because they've been trained that way, and doors open for them much more naturally, right? So, if you're one of the rest of us, you can remind yourself, hey, it may feel scary, but what's the worst that can happen? Maybe they're gonna not like me and reject me, or maybe I'm gonna meet some new cool people. All right. James asks, how come Aristotle's politics isn't taught as much as his ethics or as much as Plato's politics? My political philosophy classes barely, if any, mentioned Aristotle. I would never take your own classes as the sample for what's going on across the board in teaching, right? I would hazard a guess to say that within political science departments, the politics is taught way more often than the ethics, and Aristotle is taught way more often than Plato is. We have similar things as well. If you're in the English department, you're reading Aristotle's rhetoric and poetics more often than you're reading the politics or the ethics, although they would both be quite helpful to put together. I don't know that Aristotle's politics is taught less often than the ethics in political theory classes. I can tell you that in ethics classes, we usually focus on the Nicomachean ethics, but we usually don't get to teach the whole of the Nicomachean ethics even. I sometimes bring in some stuff from the politics, like the discussion in book 1 about the nature of wealth, but yeah, it really depends on what school we're talking about, what department, Here's a good question about AntiOedipus. What concepts or philosophers should one be familiar with before diving into AntiOedipus? I've heard it's quite a hard book. I'm unsure if it's because of the technicality or the dense references. It's both, and it's also because it's Deleuze and Guattari working together, so you get this weird, wacky, wild shit going on, that is reflective of the era that they're in, So there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of reasons why it's difficult. I mean, obviously, so that it's about Freud, Freudianism. So you probably want to read some Freud. You probably want to read some Lacan because they're partially responding to Lacan. But you also, here's a good bit of advice for any book. Look at the index and see what books are referenced the most, and draw upon those as well. If you find out that Nietzsche is being referenced on 30 pages, that's probably a good sign you want to read some Nietzsche, right? Because he's being brought up a lot. So so AntiOedipus in particular, I mean, the most important thing is going to be like understanding what sort of the typical Freudian approaches to things were, psychoanalytic approaches to things were. It's also important to remember when you're reading Deleuze, but also when you're reading Lacan, that there's, psychoanalysis was done in somewhat different ways in different places. So France itself became a very doctrinaire approach to things. It was here too as well for a while, but in different ways than in France, where it was so closely connected with state power in many respects. Darth Vegan, I just read Candide and wondering if the Stoics would say we live in the best of all possible worlds. The Stoics wouldn't, I would say, because they would say that's sort of a nonsensical question. Could the world be made better in different ways? Sure. And then you go ahead and do it, you don't have to necessarily worry about the entirety of the universe and how well it's arranged. I mean, you can, use providence as a way to sort of console yourself for when things go contrary to your desires and stuff. But it's kind of like a cart before the horse kind of question, I mean, in large respect too, you can say the world that we live in, from a Stoic perspective, is highly reflective of the desires and aversions and judgments and preconceptions that we bring to it. So, if you're kind of all over the map in terms of what it is that you desire, the world that you're involved in is going to be awesome when you're getting what you want, and then it's going to totally suck, and it's the worst of all worlds when you're not getting what you want or somebody else can control it. So I think that's probably the kind of approach you would want to take towards it. Sunny asks, what are some good habits to help students become better readers of philosophical and academic texts? So that's a great question. And I'm not going to try to give like a comprehensive answer to that, but I think one of the key skills that's needed in reading academic texts, particularly in philosophy, but also in other disciplines as well, is knowing when the author is presenting their position or when somebody else within the text, like Socrates in Plato's Dialogues, is presenting their position, and when they're presenting and critiquing or examining somebody else's point of view. So I often have a lot of students who mix up what Socrates is saying with what Thrasymachus is saying, and in Republic Book 1, right? That's a mistake you don't want to make, right? Because then everything gets really quite confused. When you're reading Aristotle, it's important to realize that Aristotle approaches things dialectically, which means that he looks at what other people have to say about a topic before putting forth his own views. Being able to, so another similar connected skill, being able to read and understand a position without worrying at first about whether it's true or false, which usually winds up meaning whether it jibes with what you're bringing yourself already to the text. Being able to actually hear somebody's perspective or worldview or arguments without needing to be the critic immediately. There's plenty of time for criticism later. First, you have to actually figure out what the person is saying. So I think that's that's really important. Not expecting everything to be laid on the table all at once is another useful skill. I mentioned that I was doing some videos on Nietzsche. Nietzsche doesn't always tell you in a chapter, entitled this, after doing these particular chapters, exactly what he thinks and only what he thinks about this topic. He's all over the map, right? So you have to get used to drawing connections between what he says over here, what he says over here, and then bringing it together in some sort of synthetic interpretation of your own, which might be wrong and might grow over time, right? Another thing too, I would say is sort of a negative, something you don't want to do. Don't draw superficial parallelisms between things, right? Just because something looks like it's doing a similar thing to this author over here, doesn't mean that they're actually doing the same thing or that it's connected, or that you should be like going down that line rather than trying to figure out the more deep connections that might exist between things, And then I would also say too, don't rely on shitty histories of philosophy that make everything out to be like, well, first there's this period and everything in this period is of this sort, and then we have this shift to this period, and that happens because of these three factors here. Those are often, or everything is footnotes to Plato and maybe also Aristotle, so everyone's a Platonist or Aristotelian. Those are actually a waste of your time, those very schematic arrangements. They'll hold you back from being able to see what's actually there in the philosophical texts. All right, another good question here. No more backer wars. That's a funny reference. I want there to be another war. I've read all 7 volumes all the way to the Unholy Consult, and I don't want it to end there. I want there to be somebody fighting for the human beings against the consult. That's kind of an inside joke if you haven't read R. Scott Backer's Second Apocalypse series, which is quite a slog. So here's the question. Any tips for someone new to teaching? How does a teacher know their lessons have been taken to heart? Okay, so those are 2 really, really interesting questions. Let me answer the second one first. You never really, really know. Unless somebody contacts you and says, hey, you remember that class that you taught 5 years ago, and I was sitting there and we were talking about this idea. I used that today, unless somebody comes straight out and indicates these things to you. I don't know that you can easily find that sort of thing out, right? Tips for someone new to teaching. So there's a lot of things that you could say. One is be willing to go off on side paths, right? And you don't have to stick strictly to your lesson plan that you come in with. You can take what the students have to say and think through problems in the middle of class, right? Oftentimes they like that. It's you relating to them. I would avoid making too many pop culture references because they get stale pretty quickly and you start to rely on them. Like so many of my peers from my generation invested so much of their like shtick in teaching into Star Trek references that then students had no idea what the hell they were talking about, So I wouldn't try to be like, I'm just like one of you. I wouldn't also give them that sort of like BS, like I learn more from my students than my students do from me. Because then the students will say to you, well, then why aren't we getting paid instead of you getting paid, right? So, there should be some recognition that you have something to contribute there. There's going to be all sorts of unforeseen circumstances that are going to arise, especially in this COVID time. I would say worry less right now about being a disciplinarian and more about, your students as human beings and whether they're getting something out of the class that they're paying for or not. Those are, this is not a very comprehensive list of things that you could do as a teacher, but Hopefully they are useful for you. Tarshan asks, what do you think is the hardest branch of philosophy or philosopher to understand or read? I don't know that there is a hardest in like a, like a listing scale, right? Different people find different philosophers more difficult at different times in their life. I know for myself, when I was a student, there were some philosophers who I read and I was like, I can't figure out what the hell this person's talking about. And now I find them, much more easy to make sense of. Some of it also depends on how good of a writer they are. I mean, I think Hegel is kind of held back by the fact that he's not stylistically, he's not that good of a writer compared to, say Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or people like that. Also say that a good bit of late 20th century French philosophy is overcomplicated. There are a lot of word games going on that don't need to be there, that kind of stand in the way. But then again, I didn't write their books, so I've only got one book, and Derrida has who knows how many. So I don't know about that. All right, Ethi, do I think I'd be well equipped to help somebody analyze their moral theory and try to find potential holes in it? Yeah, I mean, I do that. That's part of what we do in philosophical counseling, which I've been carrying on since 2014, so going on 7 years now. That's also what we do in consulting work sometimes, like working with corporations on their ethics stuff. So yeah, I think I'd be equipped to it, to do it. And I use resources from philosophy and techniques. Arnaldo asked, do I think McIntyre's project succeeds? Do I believe that secular morality has bad foundations? So those are two totally disconnected things. McIntyre and I've got the book right here, in After Virtue, right? He's not a religious thinker. He's advocating something like a return to some sort of Aristotelianism, broadly speaking. It's only in his later books where, he talks about Thomism and stuff like that. And he's actually, he's pretty cagey about that. When you ask, like, there's a great interview in Kinesis, which was the graduate journal of Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. I was on the editorial staff of that. And in it, they ask him, why did you become a Catholic? And he's like, because the sacraments are there, And when in discussions with him, he tends to think that the idea that you have to be, you have to be a Christian or something in order to understand morality properly, he doesn't buy that. So I don't know how those are connected for you in your head, but what is McIntyre's project? His project is to engage in cultural critique, to figure out where things went wrong, and then to suggest some important guidelines and do a whole bunch of other things along the way, like, say, don't have too much faith in social science. And that's something he was doing way back before After Virtue. So is his project successful? I'd say that part of it is successful. Was he supposed to, by his writing, produce some massive new effect within civil society? I don't think he thought that that's what his writing was automatically going to do. So it all depends on what you mean by his project and how we want to see it as successful. All right. Well, here's a really interesting set of questions from Tyson. Who are the philosophers that were doing similar type of work as Wittgenstein, but are more informed and have greater potential for doing something with their philosophy? And are there any philosophers that have similar parallels to what the ordinary language philosophers were doing? So I would say that, let's confine ourselves to talking about the middle to late Wittgenstein, not the Tractatus Wittgenstein, because there's plenty of people doing that sort of stuff. The Vienna Circle, anybody who thinks that symbolic logic is basically how we describe the universe, because a good portion of the Tractatus is just like outlining a theory of logic and its application to the world and to language. But if we're thinking about the Wittgenstein who's interested in forms of life and language games and, how we make sense of things and taking what we call the linguistic turn, yeah, there's a lot of people who are doing interesting, similar, connected projects. One of them I would mention is John Wisdom, right? I keep talking about him over and over again in these things. He was an analytic philosopher who also thought it was important to read outside of just English philosophy or outside of, logic stuff. And so he's got some very interesting reflections on religion, on Freudianism, on Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism. And there's people who studied with Wittgenstein or influenced by Wittgenstein, but then extended it into other areas as well. But then, in continental philosophy, there's all sorts of people that are interested in language and its connections with community, power, things like that. Paul Ricoeur would be a prime example of somebody who, as a continental philosopher, very well read, also engaged with analytic philosophy in important ways. Lyotard actually takes some ideas from Wittgenstein and applies them in his work. But that's a good question. I mean, who else should come to mind? I mean, there's earlier writers who are also interested in language. It's not like Wittgenstein discovered the importance of language in shaping our world. That is something that's already there in some of the philosophers of the 18th century and 19th century, like Hamann, for example, or I mean, we go all the way back to Vico too, right? In the early modern period. So, I think there's quite a few people that are doing similar things to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, I think, is quite often doing interesting stuff, but a lot of the time, it's almost like watching somebody in a movie where you're like, "Don't go in there. Hey, the thing you want is over there." You can see, like, an uncertainty, for example. So many paragraphs to get to the insights that he has. So, all right. Sonny, what is postmodernism? That's not something that has a simple answer. I mean, why don't you get yourself Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition and read your way through that and then see what you think of it. I'll tell you what it's not. It's not something simple that you can easily summarize and then say, oh, there's postmodernism here and postmodernism there. The word has all sorts of meanings. It's been, kicking around since the 1970s, as far as I know. And, it's a term that we probably should be suspect when people use a lot of the time. Pasta says, any tensions in Epictetus between passages with an intellectualist view, like the Medea example, versus others, put emphasis on practice as if knowledge alone is insufficient? No, because Epictetus doesn't have an intellectualist view. I'm not even sure what you mean by that, because that can mean a million different things, right? But if you think that there's that Epictetus taking a few things out of context and saying, these passages outlined over here have an intellectualist view. I mean, the Medea thing, I don't see that as having anything that corresponds to what I would call an intellectualist view. Medea is brought up precisely for two reasons. One is as an example of somebody whose emotional state overrides her what she knows she ought to do, right? My thumos is what I'm going to listen to. And then he also says, hey, by the way, you who get pissed off at Medea, look at yourself. I don't see that as particularly intellectualist. But let's say it was. Then you contextualize it within the larger philosophy that we have in Epictetus, All right. Oh, it just skipped. Let me get back to here. There's a lot of questions. God Word podcast. So much of professionalism is total BS. How can I get and hold down a job even though it seems fake and upside down? Yeah, that's quite true. There's a lot of things that you do. So here's part of what my experience. You're right. A lot of things that we call professionalism in like philosophy or in fields in general turns out to be stuff that doesn't really matter and doesn't get what we want in the first place. And it's a way of, kind of engaging in social control. And the worst is there's a tendency for we ourselves to buy into it and become ourselves policers of it, and then policing ourselves and making us feel bad. There are some things that do fit into what people call professionalism that I think are less about professionalism and more about not being a jerk, like, following up on correspondence, which I'm not always great with, by the way. Sometimes it takes me longer than I want to respond to emails, or they get, buried beneath a whole bunch of other emails. I have to like write somebody and say, oh, I'm so sorry for taking so long to get back to you. I don't have any good excuse for this. But that's not really about professionalism, and that's more about just being a decent person. If somebody talks to you and you want to be, good to them, you should talk back, right? There's a lot of other things like, do you need to wear a dress shirt? Here's a great example. Do you need to wear a dress shirt not in the classroom, on a Zoom call with your colleagues, or when you're teaching? Or, this is where things get really crazy. There are professors who are insisting that every student on their Zoom, class sessions not only has the camera on, but is dressed up. And I look at that and I'm like, that's not professionalism. That's just being a jerk to your students. Why would you impose that on them? Because we're going to, stress to them the importance of the workplace and how to be a really, well put together person. I don't know that that's reflective of that. So yeah, I'd agree with you. A lot of professionalism is BS. And a lot of it is tied to very arbitrary stuff, it's used to bash people a lot of the time. Gamut says, I've been going through the Republic. I wonder why you think Plato Socrates says a king that makes mistakes is not a king. Doctor making a mistake isn't a doctor. It's actually Thrasymachus who says that, right? Rather than Plato himself. So I think that's the key there. Mashal, which philosophers do you think have the best take on existential anxiety? Also, do you agree that one should entertain their anxiety? I'm not sure what entertain anxiety means. Should you take your anxiety seriously? Is that what it means? Because if that's the case, then yeah, in certain respects. A lot of the things we're anxious about not to be really worth being anxious about. We do, the people that are, here's a great example, the people that are worried about cancel culture and Mr. Potato Head, being male or female, or the Dr. Seuss estate, not republishing 6 books. Those things are total bullshit. Nobody should give a shit about any of that stuff, right? Not when we have, even before COVID. Let's put COVID aside, which is still a major issue. We had incredible political polarization. We have incredible inequities within our society. We are moving towards more and more environmental crisis. If you're not focused on that stuff and worried about those sorts of things, as well as the day-to-day things like, how am I going to hold down my job? How am I going to keep, house and home together? Are bad things going to happen to me? And you're more worried about trivial bullshit like, essentially culture matters of Dr. Seuss. You've really got things backward. If Dr. Seuss, some books not being republished induces anxiety in you, you're a mess. And that is the case for a lot of people, right? So we should be okay with some degree of what the existentialists call anxiety, which really has to do with our freedom and with what we're going to make of it, our responsibility. There's something to be said for that, right? A lot of the trivial shit, we probably shouldn't be worried about that. All right. Johann, was Maurice Blondel influenced by Platonic philosophy? I mean, in the sense that everybody's influenced by Platonic philosophy, sure. If you want to know who he's influenced by more, I would look at the authors that he brings up more often. It's not Plato. He's influenced by Aristotle and Plato and the medievals, who he was one of the first people to actually teach in the French Academy, by the way, before Jules Somme did in his classes. He's influenced by, all sorts of Christian thinkers. He's influenced by his readings of modern thinkers like Descartes and Kant and Hegel. His Hegel is not the phenomenology. It's mostly the logic that he read. He's influenced by Henry Newman. He's influenced by Maine de Biran. He's influenced by Pascal. He's influenced by Leibniz, who he wrote one of his dissertations on. So, he's influenced by a whole bunch of people, and he's doing his own kind of unique thing as well. All right, Andrew, why do I think Dostoevsky wrote philosophical fiction instead of nonfiction? I don't know. It's a good question. I guess he liked writing fiction, and he thought that he could do the sort of things that he wanted to do writing that. And also, another thing is you could write serialized fiction and stay just ahead of your creditors with the vast gambling debts that you'd built up by, writing things in serial form. But I think he was drawn to the idea of having characters who would raise issues and express things. Why did Philip K. Dick write fiction instead of writing philosophy? Or why did somebody we're going to again talk about this month? Why did R. Scott Bakker drop out of Vanderbilt, not finish his dissertation, and instead write his Second Apocalypse 7-book series of works along with things? Well, he has also done some academic philosophy on the side and consciousness stuff. Because you can have characters like work thoughts out. I think there's something about that. By the way, I'm not somebody who does that. I've never really. I have tried my hand at writing stories back when I was an undergraduate, but I haven't done it for a long time. And I don't think the stories I wrote were particularly good back then. They're all probably lost. So I wrote them on a typewriter at that time. All right. Lord Roku, I'm pretty sure that you've read Ecclesiastes. What are your thoughts on the philosophy that it gets expounded in there? That's a good question. A lot of people read the book of Ecclesiastes and they're like, oh, it's just pessimism, But when you read further on into the work, right? And it still holds that there might not be an afterlife, but there is still good and bad. And we still should, do things the right way. That's an interesting point of view within that text. Alberto, opinion on Jethro Tull. Definitely not metal, despite the Grammys awarding them a metal Grammy, which is kind of a travesty. I like Jethro Tull. And I think they're good to listen to. They're interesting prog rock, basically, heavy rock, but not metal. So let's see here. Edmund, what concepts, if any, would you say are lost or commonly misunderstood in translation from Epictetus? I don't know if anything's lost in translation. What are some ideas that are misunderstood? The dichotomy of control. A lot of people are like, that's the centerpiece of Stoicism, and that's wrong. That's just one idea, one helpful set of practices. It's not the centerpiece, the linchpin of Stoicism. It's one out of many important ideas that you find in there. I would say that there's not enough emphasis on how it is that proeresis determines itself and develops itself. Proeresis is the faculty of choice. A lot of people get mixed up. They think that the faculty of choice, or the will, sometimes translated as, and the rational faculty and the ruling faculty are different things. I would say in Epictetus they're not, actually. And he is the person who talks the most about the faculty of choice, proiresis. In order to understand what proiresis means for Epictetus, you have to read Epictetus. You cannot begin by just looking at Arius Didymus or Diogenes Laertes, where it says proiresis is choice before a choice, because that is definitely not an adequate characterization of it. What else in Epictetus? Habit is incredibly important in Epictetus. The notion of the indifference, the externals. He is totally crystal clear over and over again that they, strictly speaking, are outside of our control, but our use of them, the way that we deal with them, is in our control, right? So that extends that whole dichotomy of control thing in important ways beyond what you get in, Enchiridion 1 and Discourses 1:1. So those are a couple examples. Liquid has a very difficult to answer question. What is your take on contemporary philosophers? Are there any you recommend? There is such a vast field of contemporary philosophers. People are often like, hey, have you read this guy? Have you heard of this person over here? And I'll be like with Aristotle scholarship. Somebody had a comment on one of my videos recently where they're like, I really like so-and-so's take on this in Aristotle's Politics. And I was like, buddy, there's 10,000 people you could recommend. I haven't read this person, and I'm somebody who actually does work on Aristotle. There's so many interesting people out there. I'm actually going to turn the question on its head. I'm going to say, don't worry so much about people doing original work, the new minds of the century or something like that. And look at the people who are doing work that's engaged with other philosophers and making something out of them. They have some interesting interpretations. Like again, I'll mention somebody who I'm really fond of, both as a person and as a scholar. My colleague Chris Gill. He's got a lot of works out. I enjoy reading his works. He is making original points, but he's usually making it in relation to what the Stoics are saying or what Hellenistic philosophy is about. He's not trying to forge a whole new path himself, and I think that for me, I like that. I like having conversations about these other thinkers. All right, here's a question from April. Why would you let anyone, no matter how big the name is, influence you? They don't live your experience. Philosophy is just one big story with many directions and many authors. Well, you'd let people influence you because you're open to being influenced by other people, because that's a good thing. Because that's part of the way that we learn as human beings. I'm influenced by all sorts of philosophers. I don't think that's a bad thing, right? Steve says, there's a kind of cryptic comment. Aristotle says animals are souls, i.e. cats and dogs. Well, they have souls, right? Yeah, but soul means something different in Aristotle than it does, say, for, Christian theologians or somebody like that. Although, Aquinas, of course, buys into that. They just have animal souls. Reuben, I find confusing the opposites argument in Phaedo. Plato himself says the world has no perfection, therefore no perfect symmetry. So, of course, everything will come either from something bigger or smaller than itself. Yeah, okay. I don't think that the opposites is saying that things are coming from the forms themselves, right? He's just talking about how opposition works. Stacy asks, what do I think of Alvin Plantinga? I think he's an interesting person. I've seen him speak before. I think that, I think that he's essentially an analytic philosopher of religion. I can't think of anything that he's done or said where I was like, wow, that is amazing, first rate. He's certainly held in very high esteem within certain Christian philosophical circles. But one of the problems is he wrote some interesting things on Christian philosophy, and he, in effect, retraced, but not in as good of a way, what people in these long debates that I do research on had been saying about it since the 50s. And this is one of the problems with the analytic philosophy in general, is they don't do enough reading of other people. And so they recreate something, and it's usually not going as deep. This kind of goes to the Wittgenstein question earlier too. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel, All right. Mason, what can Stoicism offer to someone who loses a loved one? It's not going to offer anything right off the bat, like, you lose somebody and then you're like, oh, I better go get some Stoic literature so I can make myself feel better. It's like anything else. You have to have been practicing it for a while. Just like if you don't lift weights or exercise or anything like that, and then you get thrown into a situation where you need to do some physical things, you're not going to, just by being handed a bunch of weights, you're not going to be up to the challenge. I suppose for somebody who has no encounter with it, maybe a few Stoic dogmata might be helpful, but they're probably not going to be all that helpful. Instead, it's something that you want to do before you lose the loved one, right? And then I think one of the most useful things about it, so there's this passage in Epictetus's Enchiridion where he says, when you kiss your wife or child, remind yourself of what they are so that when they die, you're not going to be so upset. And people are like, well, that sucks. Stoics are, really heartless bastards, right? And the beginning of the passage says, for anything that you find useful or that you feel affection towards, philostorgein, right? And that includes the wife and child or whoever, it could be my cat over there who's slowly dying of, we found out, bladder cancer, 18 years old. One of the things that comes out of thinking about Epictetus' stuff, people think that if you're not like showing visible signs of grief or not getting upset, that you didn't really love the person. And those are disconnected. You can love the person. That doesn't mean that you have to feel as if the whole world has come to an end because they're gone. You can still like honor them and go over the memories. Now, that said, it doesn't mean that we have to like just reject sadness or anything like that. I mean, I'm still sad about missing my mom and dad, who one of whom died 20 years ago, and the other one died when I was just a kid. And I sometimes grieve the missed opportunities. There's things that I would like to talk with them about, as my own kids are growing into adults. But it doesn't have to be so overwrought emotionality, right? We have some choice in the matter. We can direct our selves, and we can engage in self-scrutiny and figure out which emotional responses make sense and which are kind of excessive, and we can do things about that. Shulgi asks, what is my view on Eastern philosophy? Is there a chance we could get a lecture analysis on the channel about it, or are you centered on Western philosophy? So I'll say there's no such thing as Eastern philosophy. And I think that talking about it in those ways is actually counterproductive and kind of, it's often indulgent. Western philosophy is itself incredibly rich and vast, and we should talk instead about comparative philosophy, and we should talk about particular cultural spheres. So there's Chinese philosophy, and then the other areas that were particularly impacted by Chinese culture, like Japan, Korea, Vietnam. That is its own sphere with its own stuff going on. That's as different from Indian philosophy as it is from, say, early modern philosophy, like Descartes or things like that, and yet there'll be parallels between them, and there's a lot of commonalities between what's going on in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and what's happening in Chinese philosophy. And we can talk about cultural spheres. We can talk about the Chinese cultural sphere. We can talk about the Indian subcontinent. We can talk about the entire Islamic world, and all of these interpenetrate each other. And then we can talk about other things that we can say: are they philosophy? Are they not? There's debate to be had, but I'm willing to let them in the door. I focus mostly on the stuff that I can be very competent in because I know the languages. I don't read classical Chinese. So I'm at a disadvantage in talking about mensis or, about later Neo-Confucianism or anything like that. I mean, I teach classes on it, but I don't shoot a lot of content because there's other people out there who can do that. I don't have to do everything. Even within Western philosophy, if we're going to call it that, just call it European philosophy. I don't tackle every single author. Right? It may look like that, but for me, from my perspective, there's all these big gaps. So I try to stick to what I can do best. I certainly have a lot of respect for those who can read Pali or Sanskrit or Japanese or and read these texts. And I think it's good to know your limitations. Sergey says, when it comes to unpleasant emotions like anxiety, do you think you should strive to reduce them as much as humanly possible, or do you think it's about feeling them at appropriate times and amounts? It depends on the emotion. I mean, with anxiety, the modality of fear, right? I mean, even the Stoics say there's rational fear. They call that eulabea, caution, right? There's other emotions like envy. I don't think there's ever really any good envy, when people say, oh, yeah, but what if it leads you to do good things? Yeah, so something bad led you to do something good. Doesn't make it necessarily good. What about emulation? Well, that's different. Aristotle already saw that from envy, So I think there can be some where we do want to try to reduce. We probably can't get rid of them altogether. We probably want to reduce them as much as possible. And then there's others where it is really about feeling them at appropriate times and amounts, You don't have to be an Aristotelian to see that. All right. Let's see here. Is Nietzsche the worst philosopher? No. That's easy to answer. Pointsman, any thoughts on Solomon Maimon? I haven't read him, so nothing I can say about him. Merkhead Kali says, are there any Stoic books for kids to lay a foundation? Also, what's the story about your Pendleton sweater? I assume you mean by that the dude sweater, right? So, when I first started teaching and recording my videos, and I'd let my hair grow out, people are like, it looks like the dude is teaching philosophy. So it became kind of a running joke. And years back, my wife bought me that sweater as, for Christmas as a kind of gag gift in a way. And it's very comfortable and it's really nice to have. So I wear it around, and I've always wanted to do like some videos where I'll let my hair down and take the glasses off and talk in the idiom of the dude. So that's the story behind that. Are there any Stoic books for kids? That's a good question. I don't know of any, quite frankly. And that would be a really interesting challenge. How do you write a book that's going to be oriented towards kids and not like totally water things down and make it work? There is a Stoicism and Parents Facebook group. I would actually, and I'm a member of it, I would actually check them out. And I would ask them that question there in the group once you become a member, because they probably would know way better than I would. All right. Let's see who else we got here. Here's a good question. Meta procrastinator, what are some must-reads before starting on Heidegger's Being and Time? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are some things by Heidegger you could read. I think I always start my students off on what is metaphysics, and I've got some good resources for that that are available, both podcasts and videos. And that kind of gives you some of Heidegger's big themes ahead of time. It's good to know some Kant, I would definitely say. I don't think you have to actually read Husserl before reading Heidegger's Being and Time. He's mentioning Descartes, he's mentioning Aristotle, he's mentioning Plato, so you probably want to have some good some good readings of those under your belt. It is the kind of work, too, I'll mention, where you're going to go at it, and it's very technical. He's forming his own vocabulary in it. And sometimes he doesn't tell you at the start, like the ontological distinction, right? Ontical and ontological. He just invokes it at the beginning without telling you what the hell it means. Later on in the work, you kind of get some stuff about that. Yeah. All right. Let's see here. Duke says, happy Saturday. What would you say are the biggest differences between classical Platonism and Neoplatonism? They're both classical Platonism, right? They're both from the classical period. Diving into the Aeneid recently. So there's Platonism in like, Plato himself. And then there's all these interpretations that form what we call Middle Platonism. And those emerge eventually into what we call Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism is Platonism in that it's involving a rereading of the Platonic texts and trying to systematize what Plato himself didn't systematize. It's also, as is Middle Platonism. And when I say Middle Platonism, I mean people like Plutarch is a prime example. They're bringing in insights sometimes from the Stoics and from the Aristotelians. And so that's obviously not there in Plato because there's no Stoics, there's no Aristotelians in Plato's texts, right? And it's kind of interesting. Who are the really faithful Platonists? Are they the people who confine themselves to Plato's texts? I think what you're calling here classic Platonists? Or are they the people who are trying to make sense out of a Platonic perspective within a world that includes other perspectives and new ideas? There's also, we can talk about pagan Neoplatonism. We can talk about Jewish Neoplatonism with like Philo of Alexandria, who's pretty eclectic. And then there's Christian Neoplatonism as well. One thing that you can say, one really key difference, Plato never really resolved certain issues within his works. So what is the nature of the soul? He never adequately clarifies it. It's not a form. It's something that can grasp the forms. Well, what the hell is it then? It's a reality that survives indefinitely. It's related to these other things that are greater realities, right? What's the nature of the form of forms, the form beyond being, the form of the good or the beautiful? That's another issue that's clarified, I would say, in Neoplatonism, which Plato, he brings it up, but he doesn't really resolve it, So there, I would say Neoplatonism, it's the product of resolving some issues that are being brought up. And then it's also done in sort of a pedagogical manner where like, well, you should do things this way and understand this first and all that. All right, let's see. Joshua says, what's my opinion of Albert Camus, the rebel? Do I think Camus is a chilled out version of Nietzsche? No, I think Camus talks about Nietzsche, doesn't he? So you could certainly look at what he has to say about Nietzsche. He sometimes endorses him, other times doesn't. I think The Rebel's a great work. I like Camus quite a bit. I don't agree with him on some things, but I can go along his path quite a way. Don Key says, drawing on my scholarship, what might be some abductive reasoning the Stoics could bring to us 21st century schizoid people as we work towards creating artificial consciousness. So there's a lot of stuff mixed in there. I don't know that we're 21st century schizoid people. That's not a way I would recognize myself. And abductive reasoning, abduction is often opposed to induction and deduction. It's also sometimes called inference to the best explanation, and so you make kind of a leap. I don't know that the Stoics would be particularly. You could say this: the Stoics wouldn't engage in abductive reasoning that has to do with artificial consciousness. It's more like we could draw upon some ideas from the Stoics and say maybe we could use this in some way. Maybe I'll give you one example, and this is something I don't have completely worked out. I need to do some still more thinking about. So the Stoics think, as I mentioned earlier, that there's an interconnection between volition and the grasp of values and cognition. And we can frame this in terms of the proeresis, or faculty of choice, or the voluntas, right? If we're looking at Seneca, and the rational faculty, the logike, right? And these are both dimensions of the ruling faculty, the hegemonikon, which can take on all these different modifications. If you're a Stoic, you actually feel your emotions in the hegemonikon. It's not like you have a separate part of yourself. I do have to say Seneca sometimes talks along the Platonic lines, but for the most part, the orthodox Stoic position is you actually feel your emotions in your hegemonikon part, your ruling part. And so that might be, that might be a useful model for trying to think about artificial consciousness that could actually be human-like in some way. I don't know. Are there any other things? That's a good question. I'd have to think about that more. That's kind of an interesting issue to bring up. Robert Connor, what are your thoughts on Christianity these days? I mean, not much different than others. I think a lot of Christians, like throughout history, are not particularly good representatives of the ideals of the religion, but that's always been the way it's been, right? A lot of discussions here about black pills, brown pills, stuff like that. All right, let's see. Who do we have that hasn't said something? Suburban legend, is modern science more Aristotelian or Platonic? Neither. It's its own thing. And there's no such thing as modern science. There's all these sciences and lots of different theories and approaches and stuff like that. So science itself is kind of a mess. It's not something to turn into an idealized abstraction. Let's see. Gene says, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on Boethius. I enjoy his thought, but I don't see him being talked about much. I teach him, actually, in my classes. I like Boethius quite a bit. I think that one of the real tragedies is that he wasn't able to pull off his translation project because he got killed. He wanted to translate all of Plato and all of Aristotle from Greek into Latin, and he succeeded in only translating a few volumes before he was placed under house arrest. You think about how different the intellectual environment of Western Europe might have been prior to the translation project carried out in Muslim Spain. If they'd had it's not that they didn't know Aristotle and Plato, because they still had Cicero and Seneca, and you can get some good summaries of things in those, but they didn't have the texts, right? So that would have been pretty amazing if those hadn't been lost. R.T. Whitby asks, for Aristotle, what was the relationship between being knowledgeable and acting prudently? Well, prudence is its own kind of prudence or practical wisdom is its own kind of, you can call it knowledge if you want. It's a practical knowledge, right? A knowledge of what's good for us, what's good for human beings, and then it also helps us to discern things when we're dealing with particulars. You also do need some background knowledge. Like if you don't know that drinking, too much coffee is bad for you, it's going to be hard to make good decisions and be prudent about it, right? Or if you think that water is actually likely to be contaminated with microbes, and you're like, well, I'm not going to drink, 4 of these per day. You're not going to be very prudent, right? So there's a lot of connections between those. All right. Steve Fitzpatrick, can you explain the philosophy of John Locke? Sure, but not here. Right? So, Colamus says, I'm having a hard time with Backer. Maybe I'm just biased because I don't agree with him on stuff, but the beginning of the first book just feels like people being jerks to each other. Well, yeah, you are biased then. If you got to be able to distance reading somebody from agreeing with them. That's I mentioned this at the beginning. That's a basic trait or skill in philosophy. But if all you're seeing is people being jerks to each other, there's way more going on in there. So I don't know what to tell you other than you'd probably have to reread it, So it's unfortunate because rereading these myself, I'm like, wow, this is pretty amazing stuff. All right. Anastasia, are there any real bases for seeing analytical philosophy as superior to continental philosophy? I've seen that point of view quite often. There never have been, and analytic philosophy doesn't mean the same thing today as it did 30 years ago, as it did in its inception. I mean, most people who talk about an analytic approach today, we often talk about post-analytic because they've lost any mooring in their original roots. And continental philosophy names a whole bunch of different approaches, which are often quite mutually hostile to each other. So no, there's no real basis for seeing either of those as superior to each other, and there's no real basis for seeing them as the main approaches of philosophy either. All right, I'm going to skip down a bit and grab some from people who I haven't already taken questions from. So Noah asks about Chad A. Hogg and his largely negative view of contemporary academic philosophy. I don't know who he is, but I'm sure there's probably lots and lots of people out there who are asking or putting forth similar critiques. It's kind of a cottage industry. Matthew Hopkins, I'm reading a lot of the empiricists at the moment. Their work all seems to broadly follow a similar pattern, starting with psychology and epistemology, then moving on to ethics. I struggle to see how they bridge the gap between the psychology and ethics, and this seems to be very fundamental in Hobbes and Locke. So Hobbes is not an empiricist. Hobbes is actually very rationalist in many ways. Locke, there's a good bit of rationalism in him as well. They do focus on psychology. I mean, with Hobbes, the psychology is pretty short. And then he's jumping into his political theory, which occupies most of book one and pretty much all of book two. And then you get the weird, wacky crap of 3 and 4 in the Leviathan that nobody reads because it's just his theology. I don't think there's a gap that has to be bridged, right? It's not like first somebody's doing epistemology and then only afterwards doing ethics. They make epistemological points which have ethical implications within certain frameworks. That's pretty straightforward. Hume, you look at the treatise, and 2/3 of the books of the treatise are really devoted to essentially ethical topics, right? Now he'll break it down into 2 different inquiries, but even the inquiry has a lot of implications for ethics as well. So I'm not sure I'm seeing the problem there. It might be that you're demanding too much of this bridging the gap or something like that. So you probably want to abandon that metaphor and then go back at the texts and say how are these positions leading to the ethics that they have. And Locke doesn't have an awful lot of ethics. Hume has a lot more, you could say, right? Ellswitz says, is all of near future philosophy going to be in Chinese and Hindi? Why would that be the case? I mean, hopefully a lot more of it will be, but it's not like we stopped speaking English or French or Spanish or German, right? Or, like nobody can write any philosophy in Russian or in any other languages. It could be kind of cool if we have more translation back and forth. That would be very nice, but that's tough to pull off. Translation is a thankless task, you can say. All right. Champion of Wits, I found Nietzsche very inspiring and insightful. Can you recommend me others like him? It depends on what you're getting out of Nietzsche, doesn't it? Because if it's like the critique of culture and the worries about nihilism and the perspectivalism, then there's some people you could recommend. If it's like everyone needs to dominate everybody, or you're a loser, a nobody, well, there would be other other thinkers that you would recommend then, if it's the kind of unnecessary racism and stuff like that, there'd be yet other thinkers that you could recommend. So if you're into, let's say, I'll say the stuff that's the best in Nietzsche, other existentialists are doing. People that saw connections between him and others, like Lev Shestov, right, or Miguel de Unamuno, people who I've done videos on in recent years because I think that their work needs to be better appreciated. You could go backwards and look at, if you like aphoristic stuff, Lichtenberg has got some kind of cynical views on things. It's always worth reading. And Nietzsche was closely associated with Lou Andreas Salome. It's worth reading her stuff that's about Nietzsche. That's kind of interesting as well. Corby, what do I think about Friedrich Jameson and his contributions to literary criticism? Jameson is interesting to read. He can often be great at like filling in gaps for you. He's a good person to read. Not because he makes some really important novel contributions of his own, but he's like a person who tells useful narratives and directs you at things quite helpfully, I would say. Ivan, my opinion as a philosophy professor on the usefulness of studying and teaching history. Well, I mean, it all depends on how you're teaching the history, right? I would say, and this is sort of a thing, people who bill themselves as being history buffs just as much as people who call themselves political junkies usually only know like the little sliver, and it's very ideological. Teaching history in a real sense is tough to do. You have to bring in lots and lots of voices and perspectives and find ways to sort through them. I think that understanding history is very important to understanding philosophy, not just because you want to locate the philosophers in their context, but also because we are historical creatures, right? And getting yourself away from certain kinds of prevalent but bullshit histories is often very useful, like the thing that kind of dominated, from Hegel onward for a long time of, it's really Plato and Aristotle who are the most important thinkers, and they were working in a time when the Greek city-state still mattered. And then Philip of Macedon comes along and, unites Greece, and we get the Alexandrian Empire, and everything's kind of going downhill from there. It's all second rate after that. You look at that and you're like, wow, that is a stretch, man, given what we know. There's some really great philosophy in there that will lead you to totally ignore. So, having the right kind of history is kind of important. William Evans asked my thoughts on Aleister Crowley's magical philosophy, my impressions of Crowley. Same as it was back when we talked about this years ago. I'm not particularly interested in Crowley. So we're getting a little bit close to end time, so I'm gonna try to add some voices in here that haven't had anything and start picking some easy to answer questions. Let's see what we got. Scrolling down. A lot of back and forth with people chatting with each other here. Here's an interesting point. Responding to one of the questions that was asked, Ryan Holiday just wrote an all-ages book about Marcus Aurelius as a child. Could be good, could be drivel. I don't know. Somebody else would have to read it and weigh in on it. Wolves Seeking Truth. Here's an easy one. Why is the left so morally and intellectually bankrupt? Wokeness and wisdom are incompatible. I would say that's wrong on many counts. So, but you might take the time to like rethink your assumptions and why you thought you wanted to broadcast that sort of stuff here, as if that was some sort of wisdom itself. Let's see here. Oh, I'm scared to read Hegel. Is he the hardest philosopher to read in your opinion? He's tough. He's harder in some books than he is in others. There's no reason to be scared to read somebody. I mean, if you think about our emotions, right? It makes sense to be scared when something happens to you, like you find out that you might have been poisoned, right? Reading a book should never be a scary experience because what's the book going to do? Bite you? Make fun of you? You know, there's nothing a book can actually do to you that if you are thinking things through clearly would impact your physical being or even your psychological well-being. I mean, unless you chose to read a book that was like, you suck, you suck, you suck. I mean, that's kind of a boring book. I mean, you might be scared that you're wasting your time, but that's a fear not about the book, but about wasting your time. And you can think about all the stuff you also spend time on. And if you think that Hegel's scary, read somebody else. I guess there's so many other people that you have available to you. You might feel as if like you're letting yourself down if you don't read Hegel, or maybe you have to present Hegel to somebody. That could be scary, right? If you don't feel that you fully understand it. But you can just come out and say, here's the best ideas that I have, All right. Let's see here. Here's an interesting question. From Ivan. Thoughts on today's rise of popularity of internet astrology on the one hand and the other personality tests of Jungian types, and maybe in relation to Adorno's view on the occult and culture. I don't think it has much to do with Adorno's views. Adorno is not a future predictor. I don't know that there's more interest in astrology at this point in time than there was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. There's always people interested in that. I mean, you get your horoscopes in the newspaper. Personality tests seem to have been very popular since we started having social media. People would always be reporting about their Myers-Briggs stuff. or taking when Facebook first came out, there are all these tests that you could take where they're really data harvesting you. So I don't know that there's a fundamental new thing about that. There's always been people who are looking for simplistic but sophisticated sounding solutions for understanding themselves and understanding the world. And I would say that those sorts of matters appeal to that, right? So, yeah. All right. Here's a really interesting question. Favorite character from any novel or a character you identify yourself with? I don't know that I have a favorite character from any particular novel. I have lots and lots of characters who I like in certain ways and identify with. I don't know. There are characters that I can more identify with than others in the sense of like agreeing with more or seeing more of myself in them. I think in the past, I would read stuff like, say, Philip Jose Farmer, and there would be these characters who are like almost like Nietzschean supermen, right? Where they're in super great shape and they've acquired all these combat skills and they speak different languages and they're intellectually gifted and they're usually the hero. I mean, this would be like A.E. Van Vogt's World of Nale. Gilbert Gossen is kind of like that, or Kikaka in the World of Tears. Or, these characters along those lines. That's what I wanted to be like, And then I don't know how it happened, but over time I just kind of got not quite so interested in that. Maybe it's, life wearing you down and realizing you're never going to be somebody like that, and that it's sometimes more interesting to see what regular people are doing and grappling with. But that's a really great question. I think that's one that a lot of people could ask themselves, All right. Here's a one from August Dennis. Haven't watched your live stream updates in a long while. Just stopped by to say I started up a group to watch and work through your half-hour Hegel series. Well, that's very nice. I would be interested to learn how it works. do the videos actually help you out, or do they wind up being an obstacle? You know, when I started doing it, I didn't really know what the effects were going to be, and it's always good to get some, like, you know, some feedback on that sort of stuff. But that's kind of cool. I did intend for the series to help people get into the phenomenology, which is a difficult work, and, you know, not to supplement, not to replace reading it, but to help people, you know, eventually the series itself should be like one of those, you know, ladders to be thrown away once you've climbed up it, right? It should hopefully allow you to read Hegel more. And I want to do this with other thinkers too. I've done this with Epictetus and the Enchiridion, same half-hour thing. Turned it into a whole course, a free course that's in my Study with Sadler Academy. I want to do that with, you know, Rene Descartes' Meditations and the Replies and Objections, and I want to do that with Anselm's Proslogion, maybe some other works as well. We'll see. All right. Vedic Aryan says, I joined for the first time. What's the agenda for discussion? It's an AMA. That means ask me anything. It doesn't have an agenda, right? So, here's a great question from Liv. Do you think it's right for some universities to completely omit Freud? His contributions to the way we think about psychology seems fundamental, yet people dismiss him because he wasn't always right. This is a great example of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? So Freudianism itself became like the ruling orthodoxy in a lot of American psychology for quite a long time, and it stifled innovation and growth and other theories. And so it, you know, created some beefs or bad blood, you can say. And so that's a problem on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's this tendency to say, oh, Freud is all totally wrong. I mean, nobody can be totally wrong. It's all, you know, pseudoscience. Yeah, we don't have to think of it necessarily as science. We could look at some of it as, you know, useful in certain respects. The idea of doing depth psychology and investigating trauma doesn't have to be done in exactly the same way that Freud does. And we don't have to like buy into the Oedipus complex, which is pretty implausible. But, you know, we can still study him. When I'm teaching my Philosophies of Human Nature class this semester, we're going to read some Freud from his introductory lectures to psychoanalysis, in part because he's had some important cultural influence, and it's good to know what he actually thought. We don't have to study, we don't have to be Cartesians to see some value in studying Descartes, you know? So, yeah. Let's see. What else have we got? Well, here's an interesting political question that we'll probably close on. Wearing a mask in public spaces to protect others is a simple request. How can we draw on philosophy to help sort out this debate? I hope our society would be more cohesive concerning public health. So we're not going to be able to draw on philosophy to solve this debate, because the people who are anti-mask, when you look at what's going on and the justifications that they give and the affects that they show, they're not people, for the most part, that just philosophy by itself is going to reach. There's a lot of anxiety and anger and like weird reaching out for crazy conspiracy stuff. You know, the government is trying to tyrannize us. Even among, here in Wisconsin, like our Supreme Court justices, some of them are clearly nut jobs, you know, claiming that you know, a mask mandate is tyranny. It's a small thing, you know, to put it on. And these people getting hysterical. Oh, it's keeping me from being able to breathe, you know. You're like, come on, snowflake. Just put it on. Don't be a jerk, you know. Even if it's like coronavirus theater, that's not killing you to do it. The fact that people think that this is such a hill to die on for them, and they're just not going to cooperate with it, it's a sign that there's some serious mental illness out there, I would say. It's not just a matter of ideology. There's some real problems. And these are problems that are often generated by the very people that those people will vote for. I don't know that philosophy is going to help as philosophy. It's certainly something that we talk about a lot in my philosophy classes. And I can tell you that my students, for the most part, as younger people, have very little tolerance for the older people, the boomers, and people out in the suburban areas who think that this is all about their freedom. They get pretty angry about that, because they're like, we'd like to get this over with so we can get back to something that's just normal levels of screwed upness for us. So I think that's a good way to look at the issue. We can use philosophy we can use, being prudent on our own. We probably also want to think about where we can, just by modeling being a rational person, slowly bring others back into the fold. But it's not as if there aren't going to be foolish, selfish people out there who want to take a stand on this particular thing. Notice, too, that a lot of them are very inconsistent. They won't wear a mask, but they want the vaccine, because it's not a problem, and then it is a problem, or they don't want to wear a mask themselves, but they want everybody else to wear masks, or things like that. But you can think about that as typical human behavior in many respects that's fostered by the wrong sort of notion of freedom. And we could do an analysis of that, but what's going to happen when you put that analysis in somebody's face? Are they going to automatically change their mind? Not any more than they do on other moral and political issues. All right, well, that's a good place to end. And I'm going to say thanks to everybody. I didn't get to everybody, never do, but we'll see you next time around. We have some other events coming up this month that you might be interested as well. And we'll end it here. I'll see all of you later on.